The incident between Charlie Brown and Franz Stigler took place on December 20th, 1943. After a successful bombing run over Bremen, the B-17F Flying Fortress Ye Old Pub, piloted by Lieutenant Charles Charlie Brown of the United States Army Air Forces, USAAF, was severely damaged by German fighters. Shot to pieces and falling out of formation, the bomber was left behind, limping through the freezing skies of Germany, with only a few engines still running. On the ground below, German Luftwaffe pilot Franz Stigler was working on his Messerschmitt Bf 109, pulling a bullet from its radiator when Brown's crippled bomber passed low over his airfield. To Stigler, it looked like the perfect opportunity, a chance for one last victory in the deadly competition of shooting down enemy bombers. He scrambled into his fighter, took off, and quickly caught up with the wounded B-17. Inside his gun sight was an American aircraft that had no fight left in it. One squeeze of the trigger and the kill, and the medal, would be his. But then, he didn't fire. In those few frozen seconds, amid the smoke and the flame, a German pilot made a decision no one could have predicted. A choice that defied instinct, orders, and the very logic of war itself. What made a Luftwaffe ace, a man who had survived by shooting down his enemies, choose to spare a dying American bomber instead? And why, nearly half a century later, would these two men, once enemies across the sights of their guns, meet again? Not as foes, but as brothers? This is not a story of victory or defeat. It is a story of honor, of a German pilot who chose mercy over duty, and in doing so, saved the enemy he was sworn to destroy. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from? And what time is it right now? So I'll know where across America we're sharing this story together. And don't forget to subscribe and leave a comment to tell me how this story makes you feel. Europe, winter 1943. The air war over Europe had become a vast mechanical storm. Every dawn, the bombers came, endless columns of silver, crawling eastward from English airfields into the gray belly of Germany. They were the Flying Fortresses, 4-engine B-17s, each one bristling with guns and men barely old enough to shave. Above 20,000 feet, their mission was simple in words and impossible in practice: break the Reich's war machine before it broke them. By December 1943, the 8th Air Force had already lost nearly 1 in 4 bombers. They called it Black December. Crews joked grimly that the only thing higher than the altitude was the casualty rate. Yet every morning, they climbed back into those frost-covered cockpits, out of duty, habit, and a stubborn belief that somehow their courage might shorten the war. Across the continent, another rhythm beat from the airfields of northern Germany. There, men in gray flight suits readied the Messerschmitt Bf 109s, sleek knife-edged hunters designed for one purpose: to cut down bombers before they reached their targets. Among them was Franz Stigler, a 28-year-old Luftwaffe ace who had survived Africa, Sicily, and now defended the homeland itself. To his comrades, he was a model pilot, precise, unshakable, and efficient. To himself, he was a man growing tired of the arithmetic of death. He carried a small, worn book in his flight jacket, the teachings of his old squadron leader, Gustav Rödel. Rödel had once told him, "You fight by rules, you fight with honor. If I ever see you shoot a man in a parachute, I'll shoot you myself." That code had stayed with him long after the laughter and certainty of 1939 had faded into the smoke of ruined cities. On the morning of December 20th, 1943, a B-17F named Ye Old Pub lifted off from Thorpe Abbott's airfield in England. At her controls was 2nd Lieutenant Charlie Brown, a farm boy from West Virginia, flying his first mission as pilot in command. His crew, 9 men from 9 states, had taped pictures of wives, sweethearts, and hometown ball clubs to the aluminum walls of their bomber. None of them yet knew that within hours, those thin sheets of metal would be torn open by a storm of steel. The target that day, the Focke-Wulf aircraft plant in Bremen. It was heavily defended by anti-aircraft guns with radar-guided flak and the experienced fighters of JG-27 and JG-1 circling above. Even the planners knew the odds. The phrase "milk run" no longer existed in Germany's airspace. At 27,000 feet, the formation reached the outskirts of Bremen. Then, the sky exploded. Black flak blossoms tore through the air, each one a shell fragmenting into 1,000 splinters of metal. Inside the pub, Brown gripped the yoke as the bomber shuddered violently. The right wing flamed, oxygen lines burst, the tail gunner screamed through the intercom. Within minutes, 2 engines were out, the radio was gone, and the bomber fell behind the formation, a wounded fortress limping alone. Brown's co-pilot shouted over the noise, "We're losing altitude!" The airframe groaned, its skin peeling back under the cold wind. Behind them, the gray clouds parted, and through the hole came the hunters, dozens of Messerschmitts, diving in formation. Stigler was among them. He spotted the crippled B-17 trailing smoke like a comet. It was barely holding together. The code demanded he finish it quickly for one last confirmed kill. If he downed this bomber, he would earn the Knight's Cross, the highest German military honor. For most, that was reason enough. He rolled his 109 toward the target, finger resting on the trigger. But when he closed in, what he saw froze him in place. Shattered gun turrets, the tail almost gone, men slumped motionless at their posts. Through the glass nose, he glimpsed the pilot, pale, bloodied, still fighting the controls. It wasn't a battle anymore. It was execution. Stigler eased off the trigger. For a moment, both aircraft flew in eerie parallel, enemy to enemy, only yards apart. The roar of engines filled the void between them. Through the frost-cracked window, Brown turned his head and saw the German ace staring back. Neither man spoke, neither could. But in that frozen instant, something passed between them, an understanding that went beyond uniform, language, or orders. Franz Stigler made his choice. He would not kill that crew. Instead, he dipped his wing once, an old pilot's signal, and began to escort the dying bomber west, away from the guns of Bremen. The war would remember many acts of destruction that winter, but this act of restraint, would remain almost forgotten for 50 years. The wounded bomber struggled through the clouds, its engines coughing smoke across the gray horizon. The Ye Olde pub had fallen from 27,000 feet to barely 10,000, low enough for German anti-aircraft batteries to pick it up on their scopes. Inside the cockpit, Charlie Brown fought the controls, one arm numb, blood freezing in his flight suit. His instruments were dead, his crew half-conscious, oxygen gone. Behind him, the tail was a skeleton of twisted aluminum. The ball turret had been blown apart. One waist gunner lay unmoving. The others patched holes with flak jackets and rags, desperate to keep the wind from tearing them out of the sky. Then, through the haze, a silhouette appeared off their right wing. It was a Bf-109. Brown's heart stopped. "We've got a fighter!" he shouted, reaching for the trigger that no longer worked. But the German didn't fire. He simply stayed there, flying so close that Brown could see his expression through the glass. Franz Stigler, in the cockpit of his Messerschmitt, looked at the wreck beside him. He had seen hundreds of bombers fall in flames, but none like this. The B-17 was a miracle held together by faith and metal fatigue. The nose was shredded, guns dangling loose. The tail gunner was slumped in his seat, blood frozen around his harness. And still, impossibly, it flew. He pulled alongside, studying the faces through the windows. Terrified boys, some barely alive. They weren't warriors anymore. They were survivors clinging to their machine. Inside his mind, the war thundered. Duty screamed for him to finish the kill. His training, his comrades, his commanders, all demanded he fire. But the code of honor whispered louder. His mentor's words echoed, "You're a pilot first, a soldier second. You fight by rules." Stigler gestured with his gloved hand, pointing down, urging them to land in Germany. Maybe they could surrender, survive. But the bomber's pilot, stubborn and bleeding, shook his head. Home was west. England. For a long moment, they flew in parallel, enemy wings slicing the same air, 2 men on opposite sides of history, connected by something wordless. Then Stigler made his decision. He throttled up and pulled ahead, placing his 109 between the bomber and the gun batteries below. He knew the flak gunners would see only a German aircraft and hold their fire. It was madness, treason even, but he stayed there, shielding the American plane through enemy skies. Below them, the landscape changed from gray factories to snow-covered fields. Each minute brought them closer to the North Sea, closer to freedom. Brown's crew watched in disbelief as the German ace guarded them like an escort. He's Helping us? Someone muttered. No one answered. They were too afraid to believe it. At last, the coast appeared, a pale line against the winter sea. Stigler knew his duty ended there. If another Luftwaffe patrol spotted him, he'd be court-martialed, or worse. He turned toward the B-17 one last time and saluted, a crisp roll of his wings. Charlie Brown, eyes burning, lifted his hand in return. Then, as suddenly as he had appeared, the German ace peeled away, vanishing into the clouds. The "Yay Old Pub" limped over the channel, trailing smoke, every engine gasping. Hours later, it landed at an English airfield, a mangled ghost that should never have made it home. Mechanics counted more than 350 bullet holes. The crew staggered out, silent, unable to explain what had happened. When Brown filed his report, intelligence officers dismissed it. A German fighter escorted you home? That's impossible, Lieutenant. The story was buried in paperwork, sealed in disbelief. But Franz Stigler never forgot that day. Back in Germany, he told no one. He simply logged his flight, wrote nothing unusual, and sat alone in the dim light of the hangar. The war would take many more lives before it ended, but for one brief moment, in the frozen sky above the North Sea, it had spared 10. Both men would survive the war. Neither would know the other's name for nearly half a century. The war had ended, but the silence afterward was deafening. Europe lay in ruins, and the men who had fought its battles scattered back to the quiet corners of their own lives. For Charlie Brown, that December morning over Bremen refused to fade. Every night he dreamed of the German fighter, how it had hovered beside his shattered bomber, how it might have killed them all, and how it hadn't. He stayed in the Air Force for a few years, then returned home to West Virginia, building a modest life. To most, he was just another veteran, another man who'd seen too much sky and too much death. But in private, he carried a mystery. Who was that pilot? Why did he spare us? For Franz Stigler, the years after the war were harder. Germany had lost everything: its pride, its cities, its cause. The Luftwaffe no longer existed. Many of his friends were dead or missing. He left for Canada in the 1950s, working as a mechanic and flying small planes on weekends. He rarely spoke of the war, yet sometimes, when the sun hit his workshop window just right, he would glance up, seeing a B-17 drifting through memory. He, too, remembered that strange day. The cold air, the wounded bomber, the salute. In the darkest years of his life, it was the one moment that still made sense. Nearly 50 years later, in 1988, Charlie Brown, now retired and gray-haired, attended a reunion of the 379th Bomb Group in Florida. Between handshakes and old stories, he told again the tale of the German pilot who had let them go. This time, instead of laughter, there was quiet curiosity. Someone suggested he try to find the man. Brown hesitated. It had been too long. The war had buried too many names. But something inside him, the same stubbornness that once kept a burning B-17 in the air, wouldn't let go. He wrote letters to veteran organizations, to Luftwaffe archives, to historians in Germany. Weeks became months. Most never replied. But one day, a small envelope arrived from Canada. Inside was a brief note, typed on thin paper. Dear Mr. Brown, I was a pilot with JG-27. I believe I am the man you are looking for. Franz Stigler. Brown read it twice, his hands trembling. After 45 years, the ghost had a name. In the spring of 1990, they met in person in Seattle, the old bomber pilot and the German ace, two men whose lives had crossed for 10 minutes in war and for decades in memory. The meeting was simple. No ceremony, no cameras. Just two aging aviators and a silence that said everything words could not. Brown stood frozen at first, then stepped forward. You were the one, he said quietly. Stigler nodded. You were the one I spared. Then they embraced, two men who should have been enemies, holding each other like brothers. Witnesses later said they wept without shame. Over the next years, they became inseparable. They flew together at air shows, spoke at schools, and shared holidays with each other's families. When asked why he spared that bomber, Stigler always gave the same answer. I didn't see an enemy that day. I saw a man trying to save his crew. To the public, it was a story of mercy. To the veterans who heard it, it was something more, a reminder that even in a world built on orders and obedience, there was still room for choice. Brown once told a reporter, Franz gave me a lesson that no combat manual ever could. Courage isn't only pulling the trigger, it's knowing when not to. For them, the war had ended not in victory or defeat, but in understanding. By the late 1990s, they were invited to speak at museums and memorials. Younger audiences listened in disbelief. Two enemies had found friendship out of one act of grace. "It was the best Christmas gift I ever got," Brown joked once. Stigler smiled beside him. "And the only one I ever gave during the war." In their final years, Charlie Brown and Franz Stigler became quiet symbols of something larger than war. Their story, once dismissed as fantasy, began to circulate among veteran circles, history clubs, and eventually the press. Journalists, scholars, and filmmakers came knocking. What they discovered was not a tale of machines or medals, but of men, two aviators who had carried a moment of decency through half a century of silence. When Adam Makos published A Higher Call in 2012, the world finally learned what the Air Force's records never could convey, that in the bitter winter of 1943, amidst steel and smoke, one man's humanity transcended every doctrine of destruction. But for the two men themselves, the fame mattered little. What bound them was not the attention of the world, but the quiet bond of those who had seen death and refused to let it consume them. They spoke often about that day, how the engines coughed, how the air shimmered with ice, how, for a few minutes, the war seemed to hold its breath. When Stigler recalled his hesitation to fire, his voice softened. "I could see their eyes," he said. "They were kids. You don't shoot at kids trying to go home." Brown would nod, eyes distant. "You didn't just save us," he'd say. "You saved me from believing that all Germans were killers. You saved me from hate." Their friendship endured until the very end. When Stigler's health began to fade in 2008, Brown called him almost daily. They talked about the old days, the smell of oil and cordite, the rattle of machine guns, the sound of engines fading into silence. That March, Franz Stigler passed away in Vancouver. Charlie Brown died a few months later in Florida. Their obituaries, published within weeks of each other, told the same story. Two pilots, once enemies, now remembered as brothers in arms. They were buried continents apart, but those who knew them said their spirits were forever joined in that strip of airspace over the North Sea, where mercy once conquered duty. Today, historians still study the air war over Europe, the tactics, the tonnage, the loss rates. But within the pages of all those numbers lies something far rarer, the proof that even in a total war, the human heart could still disobey destruction. Modern pilots, German and American alike, have called the Brown-Stigler incident a parable for every generation that takes to the sky. It is told not for its statistics, but for its truth, that courage is not only measured in victories, but in restraint, that honor sometimes means defying what war demands. Compassion, one historian wrote, is not the absence of courage, it is its final evolution. In the closing sequence of a documentary, the camera would rise through the clouds, the same gray expanse where two aircraft once met. A faint engine hum drifts in the wind. Somewhere in that endless sky, a German fighter peels away, a wounded bomber limps home, and between them hangs the thin, invisible thread of mercy that outlasted the war itself. Narrator's closing words. They say the sky remembers everything, the contrails, the echoes, the courage. On that winter day in 1943, it remembered something rarer, forgiveness. Charlie Brown and Franz Stigler proved that even in humanity's darkest hour, the light of honor could still burn through the clouds.